Hi, Nick Tockert here with the Historical Fencing Guild, as always. But this is a video a little different than most of what I normally shoot. This is part of my supernatural defense line. This has been requested and discussed both on the channel and among some of my lovely patrons, so they'll get to see it first. Pardon the sneaky side of this angle, but I have to film this a little more covertly just to be able to get the lovely internet to do what I want with it, which is suppress it until such time as I can share it with the public at large. So the first one, monster threat we're discussing in the series is the vampire. Coming up on Halloween, and given current events, it would make sense to be mildly pondersome, if not concerned, about the vampire. But we're going to break vampires down into roughly three categories, with the caveat of a fourth that I'm not going to get into. The caveat of the fourth is the Eastern vampire. These are the myths and legends of vampire-like creatures that exist in throughout Asia, Japan, China, largely. You'll find it in the Philippines, that are radically different in function and sort of rule set. So we're not really going to go into those because those aren't my forte, and they are so diverse. Now, why did I mention that? Let's get into the vampire. The vampire is one of those myths that exists in every single culture that has written history. As long as you dig at all into the mythology and history of any culture, including they find the isolated ones in, like the extreme Amazon, you find the same monsters rearing their heads in one form or another, very similar stories. And while, whether born of, a source story, inherent to us before we split as a peoples, or simply as observations of the same events, it's fascinating. And these are the stories which me, when I am in a preternatural research mode, cryptozoology, all that fun stuff, tend to look into. Because if every culture has seen something along the lines of these things, I think there must be something to it. Either it is literally a metaphysical creature, and pardon my camera adjustment, this is my first video in the series and I'm trying something new. So there's something there. And these include a lot of things that are very common to the modern American experience through either horror or folklore, looking into our roots. These include things like vampires, werewolves, ghosts of numerous shapes and sizes, little forest-dwelling or subterranean-dwelling people, of other hominids. It's fascinating stuff, and the more you look into it, the more interesting it gets. But from the position of a swordmaster, you have sword will travel, or an author in this case, where they overlap, people ask, how would you deal with such things? So, caveating some of the more exotic vampires, which, on the subject, if you feel for some reason you are encountering something that might be more exotic than your usual flora and fauna of the metaphysical, and yes, I do approach the preternatural, the supernatural, as just that. More natural. Nature that's beyond what we understand. So I think of it in terms of creatures, like it both takes the mythology fuzziness out and it gives a practical, okay, if-then statements, so we have something to work with. Now, getting into some delightful stuff. The vampire that you're most likely to deal with in America, that I would consider a true vampire, is one of three categories. You're going to have the psychic vampire, which is the by far most common, and even if you're not a believer in such things or a writer of such things, you've encountered this creature. We'll call it a genetic or bloodborne vampire. and your classic Eastern European Dracula subset vampire. So we're going to go right in that order. The psychic vampire is someone who, while not imbibing usually in the blood of others, they draw the energy out of rooms, out of groups, either knowingly or worse, or either unknowingly or worse, knowingly, to keep themselves alive and merry and functional by simply absorbing the light, energy, joy of others. These are entities that can bring an event. Somebody walks in the room and suddenly you feel uneasy, you feel predated. They laugh at people's suffering. There's always a sense of malaise about them. And this is not to be confused with mental illness. This is a tangible sociological effect you can measure. You can interview people and watch. You can even watch micro expressions and facial expressions change. What's interesting is I've seen through my own observation when these individuals enter a group crowded area, people who have no sight nor sound nor direct connection will feel the unease simply moving through the herd of humanity. These have to be guarded against. And in literature, the energies are usually more dramatic. This is where you want to avoid permissions. You don't want to let them in literally or figuratively. It's very much the line of threshold, both of a building, such as your home, and your personal threshold have to be maintained. This is part of how you fight them. Acknowledging what they are and simply refusing an energy exchange is very important, as is simple maintaining distance. Matters of faith and shielding can be invoked. Usually a visualization of a bubble or a shield around you. Please keep it 360. You want to go spherical, not wall, if you can avoid this is basically how you avoid them, and from physical contradiction, they're still at least overtly human, so go with your gut and go to their gut. Stabbings, shootings, etc. This is how you defeat them in literature. But watch, they tend to have so complex social networks that the intelligent energy vampire establishes to further their own ends. They will acquire power overtly for their own ego, but in actuality it is to provide a constant energy stream to them. So while in the realm of physical defense, it's best to avoid them, never confront them singly, and never not have backups, because stuff gets twisted. You can get twisted by these people. I've seen it happen. I've known some people who through that in court with other things can be problematic. So, maintain your sense of self, be aware, keep distance. If your gut ever says something's not right, that's what you listen to. And then shielding based in your religious and spiritual beliefs usually is enough to deal with these. So I'm going to move on from that subject. Biological vampires. This is a big group. This lumps in everything from people with certain types of vitamin D deficiencies, skin disorders. These are the ones who the teeth can come up, the physical craving of blood. These are biological illnesses, which means, as disturbing as they may be, these are people to be pitied, but if threatened by, again, they're still very mortal, very human. The usual squishy metal to squishy bits work. Fire is your friend. Now, I had to get through these guys rather quickly so we could get into the good stuff. The vampire. The vampire, as most people think of it, as certainly in Western tradition, is an undead, blood-sucking thing that feeds on the living and corrupts the hearts and minds of men. If that doesn't make you pull the "Die, monster!" line out of your head, and what is a man but a miserable pile of secrets, crash, have at you, you haven't been paying attention to some better literature. But let's go over it and let's discuss, because movies often sanitize the whole process, and when you dig into the different folklores and the really nitty gritty, you realize that the vampire can be a much, much more threatening and difficult to contain entity. Thoroughness is always the name of the game. This is not to be taken lightly. When you are dealing with the vampire, as both a martial artist, as a survivor, your hero, you have to realize there are two modes the vampire operates: by day and by night, which seems, cliche to the point of being accepted knowledge, but it really, there are two different modes of how they're approached and how they're handled. And it has to do with the how you deal and pursue them. Now, in this, vampire is a formerly dead human who, through curse or conversion, has woken up with a set of traits. They may or may not have an aversion to light. They are usually notably dead. They crave blood. They have rules that they can and get, that they have to follow. They are tremendously physically powerful. They may have flight, shape-shifting. And it gets very complex. And understanding these complexities break down to how you deal with them. For example, the vampire is very much like wine. It becomes more potent as it ages. So, for anyone looking to engage a vampire who is newly turned, they are going to be toward the high end of human capabilities. That means they're going to be faster, stronger, have higher endurance, but they're going to be much more sensitive in the range of their essentially vampiric allergies. They're going to be much more guided by the short-term bloodthirst and much more I don't want to say negotiable, but you're working with a much more human-ish mind. Do not for a moment think it's human. The only justified explanation for why a vampire in Western lore would react the way they do to holy objects, sunlight, again, it's a little more dubious in when you get into the folklore of the destruction of sunlight. It's more of a disempowerment, but that's important because that may be when the vampire sleeps. You can engage them, but understand you are just simply fighting a faster, stronger opponent. That means you need, first off, to be all about your weaponry. You don't want to engage them alone. You want to have a plan. You want to have experienced fighters at your side. When we're talking about melee weapons in the vampire, and indeed most entities, you're going to look at two very underappreciated weapons in modern society, modern mythos, and in fantasy that really apply. You're going to look at your boar spear, and you're going to look at your axe. Oddly enough, because one of the key ways to defeat a vampire is decapitation. So you either need a heavy chopping weapon like a broadhead axe, or you need something that emulates that. A kukri would be a wonderful example of something cleaving, because a thrust alone may not stop even a young vampire. Now, vampires have been cataloged to have allergies to the purified nature of silver. Silver, metaphysically, is known as a healing, beneficial agent, and there is a reversal, a polarity when you're dealing with the undead, in which you want things that heal and are good and resonate with the living are anathema to the dead. Thus, silver, which has been purported for its healing properties for centuries, and even now is used in advanced burn creams, silver oxide, which I personally have used and found great effect from during incident in my youth. Silver can be absorbed by the body and actually facilitate healing. It's antimicrobial. It's a fascinating substance. So, applying that to a weapon is a good idea. This also will come up later when we discuss lycanthropy, as again, the purifying. It's a supernatural disease, so elements and functions that work with the supernatural, with the natural may overlap to supernatural, hence the silver. Um, where Dracula and Dracula subtype, you have to understand, you don't fight fair. All monster fighting is really, you are starting at a tremendous disadvantage. The vampire almost is the perfect version of the disadvantage. They're faster than you are. They think faster. It's not that they're smarter. Don't think of the vampire as generically more intelligent necessarily. Now there are some people who believe that the vampire functions as a sort of advanced demonic possession where the body has been transformed to be a vessel for a more demonic entity, and the entity has the access to the memories of the individual, but not the soul. It's something else behind the wheel, but it's still going to move with what the programming of the body is. It's a fascinating concept, and that is part of the element that is driven back by holy iconography. So your crosses. Now, it's interesting. It is not just the symbol, because while there is an amount of power in any of the symbols, much like how runes are purported to work, the methodology of runes these shapes have been associated with this exact set of power and meaning for so long that they retain it like a spiritual battery. It's sort of a permanent passive casting as done by the human superconscious. This is fascinating, and it does apply a bit to religion. But as I've read in several books, there's nothing sadder than an atheist holding a cross, because faith is the powerhouse that taps your boss, whomever you may say he, she, it, they to be, channels it through a focus, being the religious symbol, and that power disrupts the entity. You'll find this with spirits. You'll find this with demons. You'll find this with vampires. Oddly, not much with lycanthropes, which has always been interesting to me. It is there, but is much more downplayed. So, if you're fighting a low vampire, you obviously you have to think in terms of faster, better than you. So the ideal way is to get them pinned down. If you can pierce their heart with a wooden stake, traditionally, that paralyzes them. That should register instantly to sword types. A spear with a hardened wood point might be a good idea. Well, then you still want to make it like a boar spear where there's a cross section to keep said vampire from somehow getting down the pipe like you would with a zombie. You want to stop it, pin it, hold it down. Then hopefully one of your colleagues can come in safely and decapitate said vampire. Now, this is where it starts to get really, really, really dicey. Because to kill a vampire, depending on its level and skill set, traditionally through stories, they can still speak, which means they can summon things. They can do incantations. They can muddle the mind. Now, there are certain elements that can interfere with that process through metaphysical designs. Legends of different woods. Aspen, olive, and ash pop to mind readily, because aspen and olive are often accredited to being the the wood of the crucifix, the wood that Christ was nailed to, and all that horror, and as such have a line. There is a mythos that the silver and that chained down to Judas under the theory that for a time Judas was the first vampire. I'm not sure I buy that, but it is interesting. Aspen is ash, that is very interesting because ash actually, again, purportedly has certain healing properties, and interestingly is believed to, it is what's used to represent Yggdrasil. Go. My speech impediment does not like some of these supernatural and metaphysical words, but the tree of life is often depicted as an ash tree. So this is fascinating. Thus, an ash being an element of life and a sort of avatar in and of itself of the idea of life, possibly connected to the origin of all life according to certain pagan mythoses, interferes and short circuits essentially the unholy mojo, the death energies of the vampire, paralyzing it. Killing a vampire is very, very difficult because there are stories of remove the stake, the vampire sits back up ready to go. This is where the garlic comes in. The garlic is, again, a purifying agent. You're going to see this material: silver, garlic, salt. These are things that retard bacteria, retards infection. Remember that until modern science, evil and illness were the same. They crisscrossed. Plagues were supernatural things, not little tiny microscopic beach balls with spikes coming out of them. But so what you have is the garlic overpowers. Now there is also a practical. The smell of garlic is very pungent among herbs and flavors, especially crushed if you think about it. The vampire is often credited with very, very powerful senses, especially smell. You'll find that through most inhuman or formerly human supernatural upgrades, they get an enhanced sense of smell. So, not only is there a spiritual reason, but the simple mechanics of it overpowering the smell, essentially being tear gas for a vampire, this is an intriguing concept. So, the mouth is shoved full of that. That way, one, the fangs cannot bite, it can't intake blood, it can't rejuvenate itself, because obviously the ritual of taking blood is what keeps a vampire alive. So, decapitate it, stake it, done. Not necessarily. One, many vampires can shapeshift. And what will happen is, in that case, the body's dead, the vampire will do a last minute poof, transform into the swarm form. Usually bats or insects, crustaceans have been known to be involved. And then they scatter, and as long as one of those gets away, it may take it years to absorb enough life forces from whatever design it has to re-emerge as a vampire, but the vampire will be back, and he will be mad, it, at you, your descendants, anyone who helped you, and you've got a vampire coming back. So it's very important you go through steps. Stake, decapitate, incinerate, that way no pieces, and then relocate. So what you want to do when you're dealing with a vampire, especially a high-end vampire, you want to sever the head, stake the body, burn everything, preferably with the bit more dismemberment, because at any point any of those parts can either shapeshift or simply just pull a hand and try to get you. And then you want to distribute the ash on moving water, because for some reason the act of moving water tends to disrupt unclean spirits. You'll find that in certain ghost stories, you'll find that in vampire stories, and it's interesting how much the vampire and the ghost overlap. Okay. That's everything going well. Getting back to the how to pull this off, there are two phases in dealing with the vampire. You have the daytime offensive and the nighttime defensive. If there is a vampire in the area, you're going to see the plague of anemia is, obvious. Increased rodent action, defilement of religious iconography. Ugh. You'll find that fences are imploded, crucifixes bent or painted over or inverted. Signs of evil, corruption tends to. This is the living dead. It is a blight. It attracts other things. Shadow creatures. The higher the power of the vampire, the more evil and disruption its presence generates. You have to realize the vampire, as soon as it starts to get some age under it, is a warping. It's the closest you can. What Midwesterners can feel a storm coming in. It's a gift. You smell the air. You feel it in your bones. There's weather coming. You'll find that with sailors and stuff. The kind of atmospheric disruption that affects natural calamities that approach a varying degree. Supernatural do the same thing. People become uneasy. They can't sleep. They're more irritable. And you're going to see this all twisting up in the sort of radioactive zone of the vampire. And so it's really easy. The worse you feel, the closer you are. Now, according to a lot of legends, the vampire has to sleep during the day. We have added in its coffin, or in its own dirt, because it has ties to the grave. This is fascinating. So during the day, is if you have a non-day walking vampire, you want to find it. Find a body where it's not supposed to be. Historically, the strigoi and others would be exhumed, and they'd be found full, even bloated with blood, elongated fangs, clothing that's changed, or having possessions of people who died after the vampire that somehow are still retained. Because traditionally, you look up and somebody dies, and a couple days later, you see them walking around at night. You got a problem. And that problem is the vampire. Now, this is where physics and metaphysics get interesting. Because whether these stories are right, and especially as an author where you put them, a vampire still has to have enough energy to generate the mass to heal, to recover, and maintain itself. This is where you get into interesting things, where you may have a sword fight where you're fighting and lopping limbs, and it falls off, and the vampire either can reattach it or regrows another one. Both these actions require the expenditure of energy, and even if supernatural elements are involved, unless the vampire is channeling from an external force, which is perceived by many, it has to have a limit. Now, using medieval weaponry, vampires are one of those you really just don't want to fight. Like, there's no good way to do this, and the people who go out with sword and board, it looks good, but remember, a sword is a sidearm, and it's just not a good idea. So when you're hunting, you bring your axes, you bring your lights, you bring holy water, you bring salt. You want to block, because you don't know, so you want a ring of something that acts of its own accord. You don't need to be religious to believe that salt will You don't need to be religious for salt to have an effect on the supernatural. Okay? It just does. It's almost an alchemical reaction. And you find it across most of your supernatural baddies that are not, and I'm saying, unnatural, because the Fae are almost more supernatural, whereas the vampire is unnatural. So you have a different axis to work with here. But for things that seem to oppose nature, salt especially death. Salt is like the perfect element of earth. It tends to pull these guys back to remembering their corpses, or at least the body does. Goes into the zombie myth, but I digress. So when you fight a vampire in medieval Renaissance historical fencing stuff, Yeah, you're going to have a sword as a sidearm, but you really don't want to get to it. If you have access to holy oils, people think in terms of blessed water, but blessed water, while effective, doesn't tend to stay put as well. You can easily coat a blade in oil, if it's holy oil, blessed oil, that gives it its purifying and its contradictory effect to the vampire, and it tends to stick on the blade longer and coat the wound, essentially poisoning the vampire. This is good. Um, I, for one, have used different tropes of inscribing through different means holy symbols onto the vampire itself so that it is carrying the burning mark of, smite makes right. But it's, like I said, now you're looking at things, people are like, Nick, well, what? Hand to hand, no. Crossbows. Oh, high powered flying stakes? Absolutely. Longbows, high powered flying stakes? Absolutely. These are fascinating. Throwing stakes is really, really, throwing a metal, heavy steel spike like a torpedo, totally doable. I've done it. Throwing a wooden stake with function, well, now you need essentially a javelin, and if you're carrying something that long, you might as well just upgrade to the boar spear and have some leverage and protection that does double duty. Um, Vampires tend to have their crypts very limited in size when you get to the core of it. They also tend to have protection animals. This is where your more mundane weaponry gets to come out and play. Wolves, bats, creeping things, snakes, vermin. All these are associated and compelled by the miasma of disruption that is the vampire. So all these need to be dealt with, what they tend to be of the mundane. So, mundane weaponry. Whatever you use against these guys is going to work pretty well. Now, lesser undead, they may have zombies, animated skeletons, things like that, centered closer to them, as well as the most dangerous thing, the human servant. The Renfield of the vampire lore is a terrible and dangerous opponent because humanity is and will always be the biggest monster on Earth. At the end of the day, we're the ones who, through hook, crook, and a bizarre hive mind, could blow this place straight to Hades. Anytime if we ever decided as a unit it was worth it. That's terrifying. You don't see whales setting up to be able to blow up the world. So, the vampire, like I said, as it ages, gets worse. Not just because the psychological process of humans are food gets more and more associated, and the distancing and superiority that just makes sense from that happens. The powers seem to come online. No one's really sure how or what dictates that, but you have to be able to combat all of that. Hence, having uh, your holy protections, your spiritual protections to offset their spiritual bonuses. However you want to make that go. Look to your folklore, look to theirs. That's the offensive side. The defensive side comes at night. When night falls, you do not engage the vampire. And yes, there's stories and stuff. No, it is stupid. Their powers universally work better. They have better perception at night. They're faster. They're sneakier. They may or may not fly. They go from being threats to being special forces style threats, okay? This is bad. There are rules traditionally. And if you were fortunate and it is a vampire who is not, just a blood-crazed thing that's just a human who wants to eat blood because of a parasite or something like that. If we're talking the real unholy, the glory that is a vampire. This is an entity that will have to follow certain rules. Much like the stages of a possession. The threshold, this is my property. The vampire cannot cross that without invitation. That is a potent and powerful rule. Now, will they tear the house down to make it not exist? Will they set it on fire so that you leave? Will they use mind things to make you think any and all of these are go? Yes. Um, the vampire feeds on humanity, but if you pay attention, they're not stupid. So you have to almost think in terms of the vampire as a criminal. If there is a house that's brightly lit, religious iconography, oh, that word is getting me tonight, uh, throughout, if there is, it's noisy, the people seem aware, they've boarded their windows, locked their doors, unless the vampire is hung up due to some personal psychological thing, you resemble my dead wife, or something like that, what's going to happen is they're not going to mess with you. They're going to move on to some, probably a prostitute. I say that not bashing the nature of the occupation. That's not my place to judge. But I am citing them as vulnerable because they're isolated, they're out at night, they're limited armed, and society doesn't tend to care about them. So something like the homeless, a prostitute. The dumbest thing you could be is a late night jogger if you believe in anything supernatural. Somebody who is otherwise ill prepared and might not even be noticed. The smart vampires are the careful vampires. So you set your defenses and be careful because when we get into the zombie, your defenses can reach back and bite you. So you have to, excuse me, brother, look into that. More modern options on fighting a vampire are fascinating. Ironically, it's a great time to look at the less than lethal measures used by some riot police. There are baton rounds, both in 12 gauge and in 40 millimeter grenade launcher, which essentially shoot wooden projectiles. Hey, that sure sounds like it's a flying steak at high speed. I am never under enamored. I will always love the concept of the shotgun in supernatural defense, not just because of its short range firepower, but its the ease in which one may make custom rounds and the custom rounds that are on the market. It would be very easy to fill a shotgun full of rock salt. And remember, blessed is something that can be added as a sort of qualifier to nearly anything, provided you are either spiritually inclined or you have access to a shaman, priest, preacher, padre, a lot of P's in there, someone who is religiously and morally justified in, who knows the ritual to invoke holy energies onto an object. So, theoretically, you would want all your ammunition blessed whenever you're dealing with pretty much any of this, because it doesn't hurt. The defenses work best, so don't be afraid to stack your things. I have at some point designed a custom shotgun shell that I may someday, just as a lark, talk to someone to put together. But custom paranormal defense. The other thing is there's a lovely concept, fire purifies everything. And the Dragonfire shotgun round shoots a flaming gout of fire extensively out of surprisingly small packages, down to even 410 rounds. Now, if you see the evil, that's because in the book I'm writing right now, which is a supernatural-based book, it's a sequel to a novel no one has read, and until I completely revamp it, everyone has that novel from college, folks. Very few people have seen it. I'm thinking it will be redone, and I will just publish it because it's made a neat world that I want to revisit. But in the sequel I'm working on right now, I might lean heavy into this, so I've been thinking about it. Even if you don't have things that impede the vampiric healing factor, damage still takes energy. vampires regain energy by stealing the life force and blood from others. Therefore, if you can apply enough firepower to a given vampire, you can do enough damage that you will use up even its incredible supernatural stores of energy, and there's just simply nothing to work with on an atomic level, and you can just grind them to pieces. This is where you have fire teams with heavy machine guns, preferably belt-fed, multiple angles. You want to pin said vampire down. A good method is engage with a flamethrower because the pain overrides the vampire. It gives you very easy to see shot, and then you simply remove the mass with concerted weapons fire. I have heard some interesting stories out of Afghanistan, allegedly, involving A-10 warthogs and you know, heavy fire on a very closed area. But even if they're only fun stories, there's the point. We can better now remove the mechanical threat than ever with, weapons. But let's go back. Medieval weapons. A porcupine, the object that basically wants a slap and shoots a whole cloud of arrows. This would be a devastating weapon against a vampire. Lots of puncture points, lots of likely hitting the vital key areas, and possibly even pinning the creature down. It's funny, for a creature that's so fought, when you look at it tactically with what a person might have and what it can do, it gets grisly. Remembering also, the older a vampire gets, the more powered it may or may not, but the more experienced. It's had time to think. And the ones who live eventually either because they're lucky or they're good. And the vampire is always a tactician. They are a parasite, so they want to keep the vampire wants optimally to be undisturbed, undiscovered. They want to feed subtly, the ones that live. So the exposure often is enough to drive a vampire from an area if you can't tack it down. But going over, incapacitate, decapitate, incinerate, relocate. What I mean, once that vampire, whatever you've done, you've got it. They say moving water, okay? Moving water scatters the parts. Why? Absolute regeneration prevention. I say moving water in different areas. Optimally, you kill a vampire, half the ash goes down, to the Mississippi, half of the ash goes across the Continental Divide to be scattered. You don't want enough of this critter to come together as a critter, because it may not be all there, and you may get something closer to a ghoul, which is a carrion-feeding, undead, unthinking killing machine with most of the strengths and none of the wit. I don't know if this is what you guys want in this series, but I hope you at least find it interesting. The next one I do will be on the werewolf. And we'll put lycanthropy because werewolf is way too particular. And this is going up to my patrons first. Then the link will be revealed to everyone else. And I hope you guys enjoy it. I hope this helps the holiday season, and maybe the holiday season. Yes, I count Halloween as the holiday season. Maybe help you as the veil is thin and the nights grow cold, as the rumble outside moves upon your soul. Be ready. And as always, support your local swordmaster.